Rebecca James, a war veteran with a prosthetic arm, returns to Maple Hill to speak at the Memorial Day ceremony. Haunted by her past in Kandahar, where she lost 3 comrades protecting a girls' school, she faces a town changed by time and a mayor who views military honor as outdated. As she reconnects with her roots, visiting her grandfather's grave in the local café, tensions rise. Mayor Dalton's dismissive attitude toward her service sparks controversy, setting the stage for a powerful confrontation. Will Rebecca's quiet strength reshape the town's understanding of sacrifice, or will division prevail? If Rebecca's story of quiet strength and service moved you, join us in honoring those who serve. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread her message. Comment below, how do you define honor today? Your voice matters. Support our channel to keep these powerful stories alive. The mayor's voice was a hushed rasp, laced with barely concealed contempt as he leaned toward his aide. "Keep her away from the podium, especially in front of the kids," he muttered, his lips curling as if the very thought of her presence soured his morning coffee. To him, Rebecca James was a relic, a faded emblem of a past the town was eager to outgrow. She didn't fit the polished, modern image Maple Hill was trying to project. A quaint Midwest haven with trendy coffee shops and a revitalized Main Street. But by mid-morning, his words were swallowed by a silence so profound it seemed to hush the very breeze. On the steps of City Hall, over 400 veterans stood in resolute formation, their shoulders squared, their faces etched with quiet pride. No chants, no banners, just the glint of medals pinned to weather jackets, the unspoken weight of their sacrifices, in a stillness that commanded reverence. They arrived one by one, each step deliberate, their presence a testament to a truth the town could never erase. Maple Hill would remember this day, not for the mayor's whispered disdain, but for the unbreakable spirit of those who stood for her. The bus rolled into Maple Hill Station just as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, its brakes hissing sharply against the serene quiet of early summer. Rebecca James stepped off, her boots touching the ground with cautious precision, 1 foot at a time. The duffel bag slung over her shoulder tugged at her, a familiar weight that grounded her in the moment. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the faint tang of diesel from the departing bus and the delicate sweetness of lilacs blooming somewhere nearby. But it was the stillness that struck her most, a quiet so deep it seemed to hold its breath. It had been 12 years since she last walked these streets. In the Maple Hill she remembered, a proud little town where American flags fluttered on every porch and Memorial Day parades stretched from sunrise to sunset, felt like a distant memory. Now the flags were fewer, their colors faded by time and neglect. The mom-and-pop shops she'd known as a girl had given way to sleek coffee houses with chalkboard menus and artisanal logos, while others stood shuttered, their windows dark and coated with dust. Rebecca adjusted her blazer, its sleeve carefully tailored to conceal the prosthetic that extended just below her elbow. Her military uniform remained folded in her bag, untouched since the last funeral she'd attended, a solemn affair where she'd stood rigid, fighting the weight of grief in the eyes of strangers. These days she craved simplicity, a life where she could blend into the background, free from the assumptions that followed her like shadows. The invitation to speak at Maple Hill's Memorial Day ceremony had arrived out of the blue, a crisp email from the town council that she'd nearly deleted without a second thought. Public speaking was the last thing she wanted, especially about the war, its scars, its losses, its ghosts that still lingered in her dreams. Yet something in the message had pulled at her, a quiet insistence she couldn't ignore. Perhaps it was the signature at the bottom, Mayor Dalton, a name unfamiliar to her, a stranger in the town she'd once called home. Or maybe it was the echo of her grandfather's voice, steady and warm, urging her to stand tall no matter the weight she carried. She turned off Main Street, her steps slow and deliberate, and followed the familiar path to the small cemetery just beyond the Baptist church. The trail hadn't changed in all these years, gravel crunching underfoot, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. The headstones were the same, their names etched deep into her memory. She found him beneath the sprawling branches of the old oak tree, its leaves whispering softly in the morning air. James Pop Harlan, Sergeant, U.S. Army, Vietnam. He'd been her anchor after her parents' death, the one who'd cooked her pancakes before school, taught her to aim a rifle with steady hands, and instilled in her a quiet pride that no hardship could shake. Kneeling beside his grave, Rebecca traced the letters of his name with her fingertips, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, Pop, I'm back. I don't know why I'm here or what I'm supposed to do, but I'm here." A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves, carrying with it a fleeting sense of peace. She lingered there, the weight of her return settling over her like a heavy coat. This wasn't the homecoming she'd envisioned all those years ago, but as she rose to her feet, she felt a flicker of resolve. This might just be the one she needed. The hum of cicadas filled the air, a steady drone that wove through the quiet of Maple Hill. It was nothing like the sounds that haunted Rebecca's nights, the ones that pulled her back to a place she'd tried to leave behind. Even now, 8 years after the ambush in Kandahar province, the crack of gunfire could jolt her awake, her heart pounding as if she were still there. Sand in her lungs, radio static hissing in her ears, the thud of a distant explosion signaling chaos. She didn't remember the pain of the blast that took her arm, only the adrenaline that surged through her, the grit of sand against her skin, the coppery scent of blood. Her unit had been stationed near a girls' school, a fragile beacon of hope in a region where education was a battleground. The militants saw it as a threat, a defiance of their control, and they'd made their intentions clear with gunfire and threats scrawled in the dust. But what stayed with Rebecca weren't the attacks or the chaos, it was the girls. Their small hands clutched notebooks like lifelines, their eyes carrying a weight far too heavy for their years, a mixture of fear and defiance that mirrored her own. Those faces followed her, etched into her memory as vividly as the names on the cemetery stones, a reminder of why she'd fought and why she'd come back to Maple Hill. The morning had started like any other, with the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the training field during drills. But chaos erupted when the enemy struck, turning routine into a brutal, hours-long battle. Rebecca James fought with everything she had, her heart pounding, her mind razor-focused on survival. By the time the dust settled, 3 of her closest friends, Michael, Sarah, and Damon, lay lifeless. Rebecca barely made it out, her body broken, her spirit shattered. Now a prosthetic leg carried her forward, a constant reminder of that day, but the invisible scars cut deeper. Survivor's guilt was a relentless weight, heavier than the body armor she'd once worn, pressing against her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. Why me, she'd ask herself in the quiet of sleepless nights. Why not Michael with his little girl waiting to hug him? Why not Sarah, who dreamed of her wedding? Why not Damon, whose laughter could light up a room? They had families, futures, people who needed them. Rebecca had only silence, an empty apartment, and memories that haunted her like ghosts. The military had done its duty, pinning medals to her chest in somber ceremonies, presenting her with neatly folded flags for each fallen teammate. They called her a hero, sent her home to Colorado, and left her to piece together a life from the fragments. But home felt foreign. The wide skies and rugged mountains of her childhood couldn't soothe the ache in her soul. She drifted at first, lost in the haze of grief and purposelessness, until she found a new calling, not in the uniform she'd once worn with pride, but in service to others. She threw herself into veteran outreach programs, helping former soldiers navigate the labyrinth of the VA, organizing food drives for those too stubborn or proud to ask for help. In the quiet moments, listening to a struggling vet, delivering groceries to a family in need, she found a flicker of peace. Not the kind that came from parades or speeches, but the kind that grew from showing up, from being there when someone needed you most. Still, the word hero grated on her nerves. People tossed it around carelessly, like a pat on the back for holding a door open. At the grocery store, strangers would spot her prosthetic, or maybe the distant look in her eyes and say, "Thank you for your service, hero." She'd nod, force a tight smile, but inside, her stomach churned. To her, heroism wasn't about medals or headlines. It was about sacrifice, the kind that cost everything. The real heroes, she believed, were the ones who didn't come home, the ones whose names were etched on stones and carried in the hearts of those they left behind. Sometimes local groups would coax her into speaking at small events. She'd stand before a modest crowd, her hands trembling slightly, and talk not of gunfights or missions, but of people. Michael, who'd sing off-key to make them laugh during long patrols. Sarah, who carried a photo of her fiancé in her pocket. Damon, who wrote letters to his mom every week. She spoke of their humanity, their love, their losses, and what it meant to stand for something bigger than yourself. But now the town of Maple Hill was calling her back, asking her to step onto a stage for their Memorial Day ceremony. The weight of expectation settled over her, not unlike the trauma she carried. In her experience, the two were intertwined, each feeding the other's intensity. Rebecca wandered down Main Street, her uneven gait drawing glances from passers-by. The faded bookstore, where she'd once lost herself in novels during Friday readings, stood quiet, its windows dusty. The diner where her grandfather used to treat her to cherry pie after Sunday services still buzzed with life. Some faces lit up with recognition. A wave from an old neighbor, a nod from a former classmate. Others stared too long, their eyes tracing her prosthetic, wondering if this woman with the quiet intensity was the same carefree girl they'd known years ago. At Maple Hill Café, the bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and slightly burnt coffee, and for a fleeting moment, she was 16 again, hunched over algebra textbooks in the corner booth, dreaming of a future she couldn't yet imagine. "Rebecca James?" a familiar voice called, pulling her back to the present. She turned to see Martha Ellison, her high school history teacher, standing behind the counter, balancing two steaming mugs. Martha's silver hair was swept into a neat bun, her smile as warm as a summer afternoon. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here, darling." Rebecca's lips curved into a small, hesitant smile. "Wasn't sure I'd come back, to be honest." They settled at a table near the window, sunlight spilling across the worn wooden floor, casting soft shadows that danced with every passing cloud. Martha didn't mince words, her eyes sharp with concern. "I heard you're speaking at the Memorial Day event." Rebecca nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "That's the plan, apparently." Martha's gaze narrowed, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Just so you know, not everyone's happy about it." Rebecca's eyebrow arched, curiosity piqued. "Oh? Who's got a problem now?" "Mayor Dalton," Martha said, her tone laced with disdain, the name practically spat out. "He's new, young, full of big ideas. Got himself elected last year, preaching about unity, progress, community pride, all fine and dandy until he starts saying traditional patriotism's dangerous." Rebecca took a slow sip of her coffee, the word dangerous lingering in her mind. "Dangerous, huh? How's that work?" Martha leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "He thinks talking about war glorifies violence, says we ought to focus on teaching kids about peaceful service, volunteering, environmental work, city planning, calls it non-combative civic duty." Rebecca tilted her head, considering the idea. "That's not a bad concept," she said carefully, her voice measured. She could see the value in it. Service didn't always mean a rifle and a uniform. She'd found purpose in helping others, after all. But something about the mayor's stance felt off, like it dismissed the sacrifices of those who'd fought, who'd died. And that stirred a quiet anger in her chest, one she wasn't ready to voice just yet. "Today, we gather in this square, under the shadow of flags and the weight of memory, to honor those who gave everything. I stand here not for myself, but for them, the men and women whose names we'll read, whose laughter I still hear, whose courage I carry in my heart. My uniform, my medals, my empty sleeve, they're not about violence, they're about love. Love for this country, for this town, for the people sitting beside you. They're about people who stood up, knowing the cost, because they believed in something bigger." Mayor Dalton speaks of service, and he's right to lift up the gardeners, the mentors, the stewards of our land. Those are noble acts, but service isn't one thing or another, it's all of it. It's the farmer who feeds us, the teacher who shapes us, the soldier who shields us. To dismiss one is to diminish all. Our children don't need to be shielded from stories of sacrifice. They need to hear them, to know what it means to give without asking for return. I lost my arm in a place far from here, but I gained something too, a truth I'll carry forever. We don't choose war, but we choose what we stand for when it comes. Those we honor today chose to stand, and because of them, we're here free to disagree, to dream, to build. So let's remember them not with silence, but with gratitude, with action, with a promise to live worthy of their gift. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried a faint chill, despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. Captain Rebecca James stood at the podium, her posture steady, her gaze unflinching, as she faced the gathered crowd in the town square. Her voice, when she spoke, was measured, devoid of flourish or drama, yet it resonated with a quiet strength that seemed to hush the rustling leaves overhead. "I've heard it whispered," she began, her words deliberate, "that people like me, those who honor military service, are relics of a bygone era, that paying tribute to soldiers sends a dangerous signal to our children, one that glorifies conflict." She let the statement hang, not with resentment, but with a clarity that demanded attention. Inside, her heart churned, not with anger, but with the weight of memory, of faces she'd never see again, of laughter silenced too soon. "I'm not here to romanticize war," she continued, her voice softening but never wavering. "No one who stared it in the face could. I'm here because I lost friends who were closer than family, and their lives deserve to be etched into our hearts." Her eyes swept over the crowd, taking in the sea of faces. Parents clutched their children a little tighter, their expressions a mix of unease and pride. Veterans, some in faded caps adorned with service pins, sat rigid, their jaws set, eyes glistening with memories they rarely shared. Rebecca's pause was brief, but it felt eternal, as if she were gathering the courage to reopen wounds she'd carried for years. "8 years ago," she said, her voice tinged with a tremor she quickly steadied, "I was deployed to a remote province just outside Kandahar, Afghanistan. My unit's mission was simple but vital: protect a small girls' school, one of the few in the region. Those girls, some as young as 6, trekked hours through dust and heat just for a chance to read, to write, to dream. The Taliban had vowed to burn that school to the ground. We were there to make sure that didn't happen." Rebecca's hands rested gently on the podium, her fingers tracing its edge as if grounding herself in the moment. Inside, her mind flickered to those early mornings in Afghanistan, the sound of laughter from the schoolyard, the girl's bright eyes filled with hope. But her voice, when it resumed, carried the weight of what came next. "The attack hit just as dawn broke," she said, her tone steady but laced with a raw edge. "We fought for hours, dust choking the air, the crack of gunfire deafening. 3 of my closest teammates didn't make it home." She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, the faces of her fallen friends vivid in her mind. Her chest tightened, but she pressed on, determined to honor them. "Captain Michael Rodriguez," she said, her voice catching slightly. "He had twin daughters, barely 5 when he left. They're almost teenagers now, growing up without his bear hugs, his bedtime stories. Lieutenant Sarah Khan, our combat medic, she threw herself into danger to save lives, never hesitating, never flinching. And Sergeant Damon Wallace." Rebecca's voice grew quieter, reverent. "He carried a wounded child out of the crossfire, shielding her with his body. He went back for another and never came out." Opening her eyes, Rebecca met the crowd's gaze, her resolve unshaken. "They didn't die for fame or politics or shiny medals," she said, her voice rising with a conviction. "They died because they believed some things are worth protecting, even if it costs everything. They believed in sacrifice, in standing for something bigger than themselves." She straightened, her shoulders squaring as pride swelled within her, mingling with grief. "Those girls at the school, they're still there, still walking those long, dusty roads. Some are training to become doctors, teachers, engineers. Their lives are proof that what we fought for wasn't war. It was possibility. It was hope." Her voice dropped, soft but piercing as she scanned the square. Memorial Day isn't about waving flags or cheering for battles won. It's about pausing to remember the people we've lost and asking ourselves why their sacrifice matters. She stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. For a moment, the square was still, the silence heavy with shared sorrow. Then slowly a veteran in the front row stood, his weathered hands trembling, but his posture proud. Another followed, then another, until the entire square rose to its feet. The silence held, a quiet woven from grief, respect, and something deeper, a reverence that transcended words. The applause began softly, a few uncertain claps from the back, as if testing the air. But it grew, swelling into a wave that washed over the crowd. Veterans stood tall, hands pressed over their hearts, some with tears streaming down their faces. Parents hoisted children onto their shoulders, whispering explanations of sacrifice and bravery. Some in the crowd saluted, others wiped their eyes, their emotions laid bare. Rebecca didn't smile. She simply nodded, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, before stepping away from the podium with the same understated grace that had carried her through every moment of her seat, her heart still racing, her mind replaying the faces of her teammates, the girls at the school, the crowd before her. Mayor Dalton approached the podium, his movements stiff, his face a mask of restraint, though his tight jaw betrayed his discomfort. He cleared his throat, the applause fading into murmurs. "Thank you, Captain James, for sharing that perspective," he said, his voice flat as if struggling to maintain neutrality. "Though I believe it's time we shift our traditions toward more modern, peaceful values." His words landed like a stone in a pond, stirring ripples of discontent. The crowd's murmurs grew sharper, laced with disapproval. A woman in the third row stood, her gray hair catching the sunlight, her voice ringing with fierce clarity. "My son died in Iraq," she declared, her eyes locked on the mayor. "Don't you dare call his sacrifice outdated." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Inside, her heart ached, a mother's grief raw and unyielding, but her pride in her son burned brighter. The ceremony ended not with fanfare, but with a quiet, unresolved tension. The crowd dispersed slowly, some lingering to share embraces or quiet words, others walking away with their thoughts heavy. Rebecca sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, her mind still in that dusty province, with her teammates, with the girls who dared to learn. She felt the weight of the day, but also a flicker of hope, that their sacrifices, their stories, would live on. The air hung heavy with unspoken grief as the wreath-laying ceremony unfolded in Maple Hill's town square. Each participant moved with deliberate care, their hearts weighed down by the solemnity of the moment. The band played a soft, mournful tune, the notes drifting through the crowd without the usual flourish of celebration. There was no room for fanfare here, only quiet reverence for those who had given everything. As the crowd began to disperse, small groups formed, their voices low, exchanging words of condolence or shared memories. Some approached Rebecca James, a woman whose presence commanded respect despite her unassuming demeanor. They clasped her hand gently, their eyes conveying gratitude that words couldn't fully capture. Rebecca, her face composed but her heart churning with a mix of pride and sorrow, nodded in acknowledgement, feeling the weight of their unspoken stories. But no one could have foreseen what would happen next. That night, as the town settled into its usual quiet, a spark ignited in the digital world. A shaky cell phone video captured by an anonymous attendee surfaced online. It was brief but powerful, showing Mayor Dalton's ill-chosen words. "Please don't let her speak in front of the children." The mayor's voice, tinged with discomfort, was quickly overshadowed by the resolute strength of Rebecca's speech, her words cutting through the air with clarity and conviction. She spoke of sacrifice, of honor, of the unyielding bond between those who serve and the nation they protect. Her voice, steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it, resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. By midnight, the video had exploded across the internet, ricocheting through veteran forums, local news outlets, and national social media groups. Hashtags like #honor not outdated and #Memorial Day. Matters began trending, each share amplifying the collective outrage and admiration. In the quiet corners of cyberspace, veterans from neighboring counties felt a stirring in their souls. Messages flew between them, private chats and comment threads buzzing with a shared sense of purpose. They weren't driven by anger or politics. This was about something deeper. Respect, a value they had sworn to uphold, a line they refused to let be crossed. Plans began to form, not with loud declarations, but with the quiet resolve of those who had faced far greater battles. Posts circulated calling for action. We stand with Rebecca James. If you can be in Maple Hill by morning, bring your uniform, bring your medals, bring your silence. It wasn't about confrontation or spectacle. It was about standing firm, a silent testament to the values they held dear. Rebecca, unaware of the storm brewing online, sat alone in her modest hotel room. Her phone was off, its screen dark as she packed her small duffel bag. To her, the day had been a painful but necessary duty, a chance to honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. Her heart ached as she folded her clothes, each movement deliberate, as if she could pack away the weight of the mayor's words along with her belongings. She planned to catch the early bus home, believing the moment had passed, that her fight was over. But for hundreds of others, it was only beginning. As dawn broke over Maple Hill, a quiet determination settled over the town, mirroring the resolve of those already gathering outside City Hall. By 8 a.m., the once sleepy sidewalks were alive with purpose. Veterans began arriving, first in small groups, then in waves that seemed to swell with every passing minute. Some wore crisp dress blues, their jackets pressed to perfection, medals gleaming in the morning sun like beacons of their past sacrifices. Others arrived in faded service jackets, VFW caps perched proudly on their heads, or old combat boots paired with jeans, the wear of time evident in every thread. A few rolled up in wheelchairs, their faces etched with both pride and pain, while others leaned on canes, their steps slow but unwavering. Each carried the unmistakable posture of those who had once sworn an oath to serve, their spines straight, their eyes fixed forward with a quiet intensity. They didn't shout or chant. They didn't wave signs or demand attention. They simply stood, their presence a powerful statement that needed no words. By 10:02 a.m., more than 400 veterans lined both sides of the wide steps leading into City Hall, forming a solemn formation that stretched across the building's facade. It wasn't a protest, it was a declaration, one that could only be felt in the weight of their silence, in the stories etched into their weathered faces and polished metals. Civilians began to gather along the sidewalks, drawn by the sight of this quiet army. Some watched in hushed awe, their hearts swelling with a mix of admiration and humility. A few brought folding chairs, setting them up for the older veterans who stood in the front rows, their bodies frail but their spirits unyielding. Others passed out water bottles, their small gestures of kindness a way to honor the men and women before them. Local reporters scrambled to capture the moment, setting up cameras and microphones. Their uncertainty palpable, but their instincts telling them this was a story that mattered. They didn't yet understand the full weight of what they were witnessing, but they felt its significance in their bones. Mayor Dalton arrived late, his briefcase clutched in one hand, a coffee cup in the other. He was a man accustomed to routine, to the predictable rhythm of his small-town authority. But as he approached City Hall, he froze, the sight before him draining the color from his face. The wall of veterans stretched across the steps, their silent presence an unspoken rebuke that hit harder than any shouted accusation. His heart raced, a mix of shame and defensiveness swirling within him. He had meant no harm with his words, he told himself. But the sight of those uniforms, those medals, those unwavering gazes made his excuses feel hollow. Slowly, almost mechanically, he climbed the steps, each one heavier than the last, as if the weight of their collective sacrifice pressed down on him. At the top stood Rebecca James, not in uniform but in a simple gray blouse and slacks. Her empty sleeves hung at her sides, a stark reminder of her own sacrifices. But she stood with a quiet dignity that needed no decorations. Flanked by 3 older veterans, their faces carved with decades of service, she was a pillar of strength. One of them, a Marine with silver hair and a chest covered in ribbons that told a story of battles fought long ago, rolled forward in his wheelchair. His hands, steady despite their age, extended an envelope to the mayor with a quiet firmness that brooked no refusal. Dalton hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly as he took it. Inside was a single photograph, Rebecca standing at the podium the day before, her voice carrying the weight of a nation's gratitude. her words a call to remember what truly mattered. The mayor's face changed, a subtle ripple of emotion crossing his features as he held the photograph in his hands. It was a worn image, edges softened by time, capturing a moment heavy with meaning. In it, Rebecca knelt in a barren, dust-choked field in Afghanistan, her posture reverent beside a simple wooden cross, hand-carved and weathered. 5 young Afghan girls stood beside her, their school uniforms crisp, despite the harsh surroundings. They were gently laying wildflowers at the cross's base, their small hands careful, their faces solemn. On the back of the photo in meticulous black ink were the words, "In memory of Sarah Khan, Kandahar. The girls still visit every year." The mayor's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching as he absorbed the weight of the image. He didn't speak. There was no need. The truth in the photograph was louder than any words he could muster. Rebecca stepped forward, her boots steady on the ground, her voice low but piercing, carrying across the gathered crowd. "This," she said, holding the mayor's gaze, "is what honor looks like." No one clapped. No one made grand declarations or filled the air with hollow speeches. The only sounds were the soft snap of flags catching the wind and the quiet, uneven breaths of those who had seen too much. Veterans, families, survivors who knew the cost of sacrifice and refused to let it be cheapened by empty gestures or political posturing. For 2 hours they stood together in that small town square, the weight of their shared silence heavier than any ceremony. At precisely noon, without a word or signal, the veterans raised their hands in a final unified salute, their movements deliberate, almost sacred. Then, as quietly as they had come, they turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the stillness of the streets. The silence they left behind roared with a power no words could match, a testament to lives given and promises kept. Rebecca was nearly done packing when a knock interrupted her thoughts. It was late morning, and her modest hotel room felt both temporary and heavy with the events of the past day. Her small suitcase lay open on the bed, filled with neatly folded clothes, a dog-eared copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its pages worn from years of reading, and a pair of polished boots she hadn't worn on this trip. They gleamed in the sunlight, a reminder of paths she'd walked and ones she'd chosen to leave behind. She crossed the room, her movements measured, and opened the door to find Mayor Dalton standing in the hallway. He was a shadow of the man who had stood so confidently on the Memorial Day stage just yesterday. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened at the collar, and deep lines etched beneath his eyes spoke of a sleepless night. His posture was uncertain, almost fragile, as if he carried a burden he wasn't sure he could set down. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it, stripped of the polished cadence he used in public. Rebecca studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp but not unkind, searching for sincerity in the man before her. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "I'm just about to check out," she said, her tone neutral, giving nothing away. "I know," he replied, lingering near the door, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. "That's why I came." He didn't sit, didn't try to make himself comfortable. Instead, he stood there, a man wrestling with words he'd clearly rehearsed but still struggled to deliver. The room felt small with the weight of his hesitation, the air thick with unspoken regret. Finally he spoke, his voice raw. "I owe you an apology, Rebecca. Not just for what I said on that stage, but for what I believed." Rebecca crossed her arms, her expression unreadable but attentive. "Go on," she said, her voice steady, inviting him to lay bare whatever truth he'd come to share. Dalton exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his confession pressed physically against him. "I grew up at the tail end of the Iraq War," he began, his eyes distant, lost in memory. "All I ever saw on the news was chaos. Bombs, bloodshed, failure. It shaped me, made me think questioning patriotism was the same as being enlightened. I told myself moving away from military values, from honoring people like you, made me better, smarter." He met her gaze, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and something deeper, shame. "But the truth is, I didn't know a damn thing. I spoke out of fear. Fear that honoring people like you, like Sarah Khan, would unravel everything I thought I was trying to build for this town. Progress, I called it, but it was just cowardice dressed up as principle." Rebecca let his words settle, giving them space to breathe. She didn't rush to respond, didn't soften the silence that stretched between them. Her own mind flickered with memories of Afghanistan, of Sarah's laughter, of the girls who still tended her grave. She thought of the veterans who had stood in the square, their silence a louder rebuke than any argument. Dalton shifted, his discomfort growing, but he pressed on. "I want to make it right," he said, his voice gaining a quiet resolve. "There's a veterans center on Elm Street. It's been shuttered for 3 years. Budget cuts, low turnout, you name it. I want to reopen it, but not as some political ploy or photo op, but as a real place, a place for healing, for connection, for people to find what they need, whether they served or not." He took a cautious step forward, his eyes searching hers for a reaction. "And I want you to help lead it." Rebecca blinked, genuinely caught off guard. The offer was unexpected, and for a moment her carefully guarded composure wavered. "I don't live here," she said, her voice quieter now, almost testing him. "I wasn't planning to stay." "I know," Dalton said quickly, his words tumbling out with a mix of hope and desperation. "But maybe you could advise us. Help us build something better, something that isn't about appearances or egos, something that's about people, with real lives." She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the town lay quiet beyond the glass. Just hours ago, the veterans had stood there, their presence a reminder of what mattered most. She thought of Sarah, of the girls in Afghanistan, of the countless others who carried their own quiet burdens. She thought of her own life, rootless, purposeful, but always moving forward, never lingering long enough to build something lasting. The idea of staying, even in a small way, stirred a mix of longing and unease in her chest. "I'll help," she said at last, her voice firm but tinged with something softer, something vulnerable. "But on one condition." Dalton's face lit with cautious hope. "Anything." "This can't be about saving face," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "It can't be about your legacy or some feel-good story for the local paper. It has to be about service. Not just military service, but real service. Community education, youth mentorship, a place where people can find purpose, no matter how they've served." Dalton nodded, his expression earnest, almost relieved. "Then we'll start there," he said, and for the first time a faint smile broke through the exhaustion on his face. "We'll build it together." Rebecca held his gaze a moment longer, searching for any trace of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded in return, sealing an unspoken promise. Outside, the town remained quiet, but within that silence was the faint stir of something new, a chance to honor the past, not with words, but with action. The crisp autumn breeze swirled through Maple Hill, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of new beginnings. 6 months had passed since Rebecca returned to her hometown, and though her heart still bore the weight of her past, a faint smile curved her lips, a small but genuine spark of hope. The town, once a place of faded memories and quiet regrets, now hummed with a renewed sense of purpose. The streets, lined with golden and crimson foliage, seemed to whisper that change was possible, even in a place where time often felt frozen. In the heart of the town square, a brick building on Elm Street stood proudly revitalized. Once a hollow shell of neglect, it now bore a freshly painted sign that read, "Maple Hill Veterans and Service Center." The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Sunlight streamed through meticulously restored windows, casting warm beams across polished hardwood floors that gleamed with care. The walls, once peeling and forgotten, were now adorned with framed portraits, not of battles or conquests, but of quiet acts of service. A volunteer handing out meals, a veteran mentoring a struggling teen, a community coming together. Inside, the air buzzed with the soft, purposeful energy of people working together. Volunteers sorted food boxes with care, their hands moving with the rhythm of shared commitment. High school students, their faces bright with youthful determination, organized stacks of donated clothing, folding each item with a sense of pride in contributing to something larger than themselves. At round tables scattered throughout the room, veterans sat with younger adults, their conversations a blend of hard-earned wisdom and cautious hope, mentoring those navigating the uncertain paths of life. At the front of the room, a modest stage held a simple podium where Mayor Dalton stood, his usual polished suit jacket replaced by a navy sweater that spoke of humility. His face, once practiced in delivering rehearsed smiles for public appearances, now carried the weight of genuine reflection. He had spent years leading Maple Hill with a focus on appearances, but the past months had taught him the value of listening, truly listening, to the needs of his community. As he addressed the crowd, his voice was steady but soft, carrying the sincerity of a man who had finally understood what leadership meant. This center, he began, as he was sweeping the room, is more than just a building. It's a living reminder that service takes many forms. It's not only about military sacrifice, though that is profound. It's about mentorship, education, compassion, and giving second chances to those who need them most. His gaze drifted to the front row where Rebecca sat, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wore civilian clothes, a simple blouse and jeans, her posture relaxed but attentive. There was no expectation in her eyes, only a quiet strength that had become her hallmark. Rebecca had been offered the role of running the center full-time, a position that would have cemented her as its public face. But she had declined, choosing instead to pour her energy into shaping its soul. Over the past 6 months, she had worked tirelessly to build programs that mattered. Job resources for former service members struggling to find their place in civilian life. A weekly PTSD support group where veterans could share their burdens in a safe space, and a mentorship network that paired seasoned veterans with at-risk youth, offering guidance to those teetering on the edge of lost potential. Her efforts were not driven by a desire for recognition, but by a deep, unspoken need to make a difference where she could. She knew the weight of war, the scars it left on the body and soul, and she carried those experiences with her as she worked to ensure no one in Maple Hill felt alone in their struggles. Mayor Dalton's voice grew warmer as he continued, his words carrying a personal note. Captain James, he said, nodding toward Rebecca, taught me that patriotism isn't about grand speeches or waving flags. It's about showing up for one another, especially when it's hard, when it's messy, when it's uncomfortable. The room erupted in applause, not the overwhelming roar of a staged event, but a steady, heartfelt acknowledgement of the truth in his words. Rebecca felt the weight of their gratitude, but it didn't swell her pride. Instead, it settled into her chest like a quiet affirmation that she was exactly where she needed to be. As the ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed to explore the center. Children, their laughter echoing with the carefree joy of youth, wandered into the art therapy room, where colorful supplies awaited their creativity. Older veterans gathered in a corner, sipping coffee and playing cards, their quiet chuckles a testament to the camaraderie that had sustained them through darker times. In the career room, a young man sat hunched over a job application, his brow furrowed with concentration. Beside him, a Marine veteran, his own journey marked by similar struggles, offered gentle guidance, his voice calm but firm as he helped the young man navigate the form. Each interaction in the center felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, weaving together the stories of those who had served and those who were still finding their way. Rebecca stood near the back of the room, engaged in a conversation with a high school senior whose eyes sparkled with ambition. The girl, barely 18, was considering enlisting in the Air Force, her questions tumbling out in a mix of excitement and nervousness. Rebecca listened intently, her responses measured and honest. She didn't offer grand speeches or polished advice. She simply shared what she knew, drawing from her own experiences without overshadowing the girl's dreams. When asked why she had returned to Maple Hill after years away, Rebecca paused, her gaze softening as she considered the question. "Because home is where you're needed," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of truth. For her, Maple Hill was no longer just a place tied to childhood memories or past pains. It was a community that had welcomed her back, not as a hero on a pedestal, but as someone who could help carry its burdens. That evening, as the late October wind tapped gently at the windows of her grandfather's old house, now her own, Rebecca moved through the small living room with a quiet sense of peace. The house, once a repository of grief and uncertainty, had become a sanctuary. She had spent months restoring it, room by room, breathing life back into its creaking floorboards and weathered walls. Each repair felt like a small act of healing, not just for the house, but for herself. She had chosen not to sell it, despite the temptation to leave the past behind. Instead, she had preserved its warmth, its history, and the heartbeat of the family who had once filled it with love. Above the fireplace, a simple wooden frame rested on the mantel, one she had crafted herself in a community woodworking class offered at the center. Nestled inside, on a bed of black velvet, was the Medal of Honor she had once kept hidden in a drawer, its weight too heavy to bear in the years after her service. For so long, it had been a reminder of loss, of the comrades she couldn't save, of the pieces of herself left behind on distant battlefields. But now it stood as a symbol of resilience, not just hers, but that of everyone who had found a way to keep going. Beside the medal were 3 photographs, each capturing a moment of connection that grounded her. One showed Captain Michael Rodriguez, his face alight with joy as he laughed with his daughters, their arms wrapped around him in a moment of pure love. Another captured Lieutenant Sarah Khan, her expression tender as she knelt beside an Afghan child, offering care in a moment of quiet humanity. The third was a snapshot of Maple Hill itself, a group of volunteers at the center, their faces glowing with purpose as they worked together to build something lasting. As Rebecca stood before the mantel, the soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet felt like a conversation with the house itself, a reminder that she was home. Not because of the memories that lingered in its walls, but because of the new purpose she had found in Maple Hill. The center, the community, the lives she was helping to shape. They were all part of a service that never ended, only changed shape. And in that transformation, Rebecca had found her place, not as a hero, but as someone who showed up, day after day, for those who needed her most. Rebecca stood in the dimly lit room of the Maple Hill Community Center, her gaze fixed on the mantel where a small, polished piece of metal rested, a fragment of a soldier's past, etched with the weight of sacrifice. Beside it, photographs captured moments frozen in time. A young Private Emily Carter, her leg wrapped in a bandage, her eyes fierce with determination despite the pain. Sergeant Damon Wallace, his grin wide and unyielding beneath a helmet caked with desert dust. Rebecca's heart swelled with a quiet pride, but it wasn't for herself. She hadn't placed the medal there to claim any honor or to bask in recognition. No, she had done it for them, for the men and women who had given pieces of themselves to a cause greater than their own lives. She had done it so their stories wouldn't fade, so their sacrifices would linger in the hearts of a town that was learning, slowly but surely, to see service in a new light. In the weeks since the center's grand opening, Maple Hill had begun to transform. It wasn't a loud, flashy change, but a subtle shift, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. At the local library, children sat wide-eyed, clutching notebooks as they interviewed veterans for a living history project. Their voices, timid at first, grew bolder as they asked about battles fought, friendships forged, and the quiet moments of courage that never made it into history books. The veterans, some with trembling hands and others with steady gazes, shared their truths, and in doing so they found a piece of themselves they thought had been lost to time. Rebecca watched these exchanges from a distance, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and awe. She hadn't expected the project to take root so deeply, but it had, and it was changing the way the town saw its heroes. At the high school, a new service learning course had taken shape. Teenagers who might have once spent their afternoons scrolling on phones or hanging out at the diner now volunteered at local nonprofits. They sorted donations at the food bank, painted fences for elderly neighbors, and mentored younger students at the elementary school. For many, it was their first taste of giving without expecting anything in return, and Rebecca could see the spark it ignited in them. She remembered one boy, Ethan, who had been skeptical at first, his arms crossed and his eyes rolling during the course orientation. But last week she'd seen him at the center, patiently helping a third grader sound out words in a picture book. His face had softened, and there was a quiet pride in his posture that hadn't been there before. Rebecca knew that feeling. It was the same one her grandfather had instilled in her all those years ago. Even Sunday services at the town's churches had taken on a new tone. The usual thanks to military members, heartfelt and deserved, had expanded to include others who served in their own way. Nurses who worked double shifts to care for the sick, teachers who stayed late to help struggling students, caregivers who tended to aging parents with unwavering patience, and postal workers who braved rain and snow to keep the town connected. They were all being recognized now. The congregation's applause grew louder each week, and Rebecca felt a lump in her throat every time she heard it. This was what she had always believed, that service wasn't confined to a uniform or a title. It was about showing up, day after day, even when the world didn't notice. It was about giving when there was nothing left to gain, when the only reward was the quiet satisfaction of knowing you'd made a difference. Mayor Dalton, too, had undergone a transformation. Once a man of grand speeches and photo opportunities, he had grown quieter, more thoughtful. Rebecca remembered the early days of the center's planning, when his words had felt rehearsed, his promises polished but hollow. She'd been wary of him then, wondering if his support was just a means to an end, a way to boost his image in an election year. But something had changed. Now, when he spoke at town meetings, he listened more than he talked, his eyes searching the room for the faces of those who rarely spoke up. On Saturdays, he brought his daughter, Lily, to the center, not with a camera crew in tow, but to serve lunch to the volunteers. Rebecca had watched him one afternoon, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, as he ladled soup into bowls and chatted with the regulars. Lily, a shy 9-year-old with braids and a gap-toothed smile, followed his lead, carefully handing out rolls and blushing when someone thanked her. The mayor's face held a softness Rebecca hadn't seen before, a mix of pride in his daughter and humility in the work they were doing together. It was as if he too was learning what service really meant. Rebecca stepped back from the mantel, her eyes lingering on the photographs. She didn't cry anymore, not like she had in the early days, when the weight of memory was too heavy to bear. But there was always a pause, a quiet echo of what might have been. She ran her fingers along the edge of a frame, the wood smooth and cool beneath her touch, and her thoughts drifted to her grandfather, James "Pop" Harlan. He had been her rock, her guide, the man who had taught her to cast a fishing line, to mend a broken fence, and most importantly, to stand firm in her beliefs without ever raising her voice. Pop had a way of making the world feel simpler, steadier, even when it was anything but. Whenever doubt crept into her heart, when she wondered if she was enough, if her efforts mattered, he'd look at her with those kind, weathered eyes and say, "True service never ends, darling. It just finds new forms." Those words had been her anchor through every storm, and now, standing in this room filled with the hum of memory and meaning, she finally understood their depth. Tonight, Rebecca felt a peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that erased pain or filled every empty space, but the kind that came from knowing you were exactly where you were meant to be. She thought of the town outside these walls, of the kids learning to listen, the volunteers giving their time, the neighbors starting to see each other's quiet sacrifices. She thought of Pop, who had served his country in uniform, and his family in countless unseen ways, and she felt a surge of gratitude for the lessons he'd left her. In a world that often overlooked the strength of dignity, Rebecca's story was a quiet reminder of something deeper than medals or applause. It was a reminder that service wasn't about standing in the spotlight or chasing glory. It was about standing for others, even when no one was watching. Whether you'd worn a uniform, raised a family, taught in a classroom, or simply helped a neighbor carry groceries, your life had meaning. Your sacrifices mattered. And maybe, just maybe, Pop Harlan had been right all along. True service never ended. It just found new forms. In today's America, where values seem to shift like sand and generations struggled to find common ground, that truth felt more vital than ever. Respect for those who came before, for those who served quietly now, and for those that still learning what service meant, was the thread that could hold it all together. Rebecca's story left a question hanging in the air, one that each person had to answer for themselves. What did service look like in their own lives? Was it caring for a spouse through illness, mentoring a younger colleague, volunteering at a church or a veterans hall, or simply listening, really listening, to someone who needed to be heard? For Rebecca, it was all of those things and more. It was the courage to honor the past while building a future where everyone's contributions were seen and valued. It was the quiet strength to keep going, even when the world didn't notice. And as she stood in that room, surrounded by the echoes of sacrifice and hope, she knew she wasn't alone in that belief. Maple Hill was proof of that.